Well, a lot of news coming out of Trump world and the legal issues in New York yesterday, with Trump getting a significant win from the appeals court with his bond being reduced to only, yes, only 175 million, but this down from the 454 million that he was originally asked to post. Our good friend Charlie Kirk tweeted this: Bernie Madoff $10 million bond for orchestrating the largest Ponzi scheme in history, defrauding 40,000 investors of billions in savings. Sam Bankman-Fried a $250 million bond for defrauding thousands of crypto investors out of billions of dollars to finance donations to Democrats and anti-Trump Republicans so they'd look the other way. Tried to use the stolen funds to bribe Donald Trump not to run. Donald Trump, $454 million bond for paying all of his loans. The bank he quote unquote defrauded testified in his defense that it would love to do business with Trump again. No victims. He helped build the New York City skyline. This is the most Soviet-style injustice ever perpetuated in American history, and it's not even close. So some of our Great Salem News Channel reporters asked some of the people on the street in New York what they thought about this $175 million bond and the overall Trump issue. This is what they had to say.
How do you feel about President Donald Trump's bond getting reduced?
Well, the fact that this had to even happen in the first place is quite ridiculous because he's actually the current president of the United States of America. So it's wild that we have to go through this kind of rigmarole, but I suppose that Abraham Lincoln had to do the exact same thing with Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederate States, when they were trying to say that he was not the president, the exact same way. It's wild, but again, I'm happy that President Trump is able to defend himself properly like every single American citizen because of the United States Constitution.
How do you feel about Donald Trump's bond getting reduced?
Disappointed.
Why?
I kind of hope that today he will go to bankruptcy and it will be the end of him.
How do you feel about Donald Trump's bond getting reduced?
I don't think it's a good idea.
No, why not?
So the bond is what the court set for him to pay, isn't it?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, this generally comes off the fact that I'm not a fan of Trump and what he stands for. So anything that goes his way which doesn't help him, I'm in favor of.
How do you feel about Donald Trump's bond getting reduced?
Actually, I think it was the right thing to do. I mean, it was excessive considering that none of the parties involved said they were lost any money. They actually said they made money, so it seemed a little odd.
So a lot of varying views, even for New York City. That's quite fascinating. But this also coming as this headline from the New York Post says that Trump's hush money trial to start April 15th after a judge denies his bid to further delay the case as ex-president's fraud bond reduced to 175 million. So let's bring in our Legal Eagle panel, Ron Coleman, who is part of the Dillon Law Group and host of the Coleman Nation podcast, and Michael Donnelly, who is a constitutional law professor. So gentlemen, this is really interesting. And I think the man on the street stuff just shows that people have a view of the law dependent on whether they love or hate Trump. And Ron, that's not really our standard in law.
Well, some people have a view not only of the law, but of reality, right? I mean, I think, New York is a big place. And every single, listen, as a young lawyer, I discovered very early that you can find an opinion to support your position under New York law, regardless of what your position is, because there have been so many reported cases, and there are always so many reported cases, all the more so just plain people on the street. New York is an extremely diverse environment.
To put it mildly, I think. Mike Donnelly, so, the appeal was reduced, and I think that the bond, and I think that that was actually wise. I mean, the Eighth Amendment does prohibit excessive fines, but do you think that Trump can actually get a fair trial in this upcoming April 15th setting?
Well, that's a fair question, Jenna. And, what I'm reminded of is the two-tiered system of justice that seems to be occurring in our country. If you're a Trump supporter or if you're aligned with the right, you get treated one way. If you're a Democrat or aligned with the Biden administration, you get treated a different way. And, the current president is facing some impeachment hearings in the House, sure, but, 8 years after the fact, right? I mean, why is no one talking about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act with regard to President Biden's visit to Ukraine when he dangled $1 billion loan to get the prosecutor fired who was investigating Burisma. So, I'm glad that President Trump's bond was reduced so he can defend himself. Can he get a fair hearing in New York City? Well, you saw 2 people for him and 2 people against him. I mean, if it splits that way on the jury, if there is a jury, there wasn't one in the Engoron case, right? This is a bench trial for the fraud case, which is also concerning. So, and the other thing, I guess, is, Judge Engoron already said he found him guilty. So I think we've got some problems there. Fair trial? I'm not so sure.
Well, I think there's a lot of due process concerns and there are problems. But Ron, let's talk about the court of public opinion compared and contrasted with the actual court of law, because it seems like all of the political fallout and even what, Trump himself goes out and he's an expert in media. All of this seems to be more focused on the court of public opinion than it does the court of law. And I think that's actually a really dangerous precedent, regardless of your feelings on Trump, for the rule of law.
Well, when you say all of this, Jenna, what do you mean? Because, there's stuff that's being filed with courts. As a general principle, I would say that if I had a client who got a $300 million reduction in the amount of a bond, that would be a pretty big win. On the other hand, if I had a client who still had to pay a $145 million bond on an utterly non-meritorious case, especially, I might be a little bit frustrated. They are proceeding on both tracks. I believe that the lawyers whom I have not worked with on this, I'm not involved in this case at all, but I do have every reason to believe that they're taking this very seriously in terms of litigation conduct. But when you say all of this, I understand you to mean the circus. It's a circus. It is a political, look, the entire prosecution is a circus. It's an absolute affront to any concept of the rule of law. I'll answer the question that you asked a second ago. There's no chance whatsoever that Trump can get a fair trial, whether it's a jury trial or it's a bench trial. Donald Trump couldn't get a 5-cent shoe shine for 5 cents in New York. It's simply, it's not going to happen. Things have just spun completely out of control. The system has been utterly compromised. And far more than what happens to Donald Trump, which is important, what has happened to the system is really distressing.
Bad. Well, and we'll have to leave it there, but Legal Eagle Panel is sticking around for the next segment. We'll be right back. Well, we'll be talking a lot more about the $1.2 trillion spending bill that President Joe Biden recently signed, unfortunately. But the Senate also voted to continue to fund the illegal immigrant flights that the Biden administration has admitted that over 350,000 illegals were flown into the country to unknown destinations. This also coming as this headline from Conservative Brief, the DOJ to create a new red flag center targeting gun rights. Buried in the massive omnibus spending bill House Speaker Mike Johnson allowed to come up for a vote late last week is funding for a new federal agency within the Justice Department that would effectively work to deny Americans their Second Amendment rights under the guise of being a quote-unquote threat. The DOJ made a statement from Attorney General Merrick Garland and announced the existence of a newly established National Extreme Risk Protection Order Resource Center. Quote, the launch of the National Extreme Risk Protection Order Resource Center will provide our partners across the country with valuable resources to keep firearms out of the hands of individuals who pose a threat to themselves or others, he said in a statement. The Attorney General, continued, the establishment of the center is the most recent illustration of the Justice Department's work to use every tool available by the historic bipartisan Safer Communities Act to protect communities from gun violence. So let's bring back our Legal Eagle panel, Ron Coleman and Mike Donnelly. So Mike, let's go to you first. This seems really dangerous and like the DOJ is not actually helping anything with the American people. They're just continuing to work to undermine the U.S. Constitution.
Well, Jenna, the Second Amendment is one of the most important rights that we have as Americans, and any action by the government relating to taking guns away from Americans should be viewed with the highest level of skepticism. people need to be able to defend themselves, and they need to be able to use firearms for whatever purpose they deem appropriate. Now, I do want to just observe a couple of things. One, it appears that this is not a new agency. That would be something that would require a lot more from Congress. This is work that's being done by a partnership between the Department of Justice and Johns Hopkins University, and it looks like they're just giving them more money. It does not create some new federally enforceable way for people to go after other people to take away their guns. What this center appears to do is create best practices, as they call best practices, sharing information with partners about all this stuff. This is something that should be at the state level. If states are going to do this, and 21 states have these red flag laws, that's where it needs to be done, and it needs to be very careful. There are due process concerns here. Civil orders do not have the same level of due process protection. The concern with red flag laws is that people are having their guns taken away before they have due process. So if the federal government's getting involved here, that automatically concerns me. But I want to make sure people understand that this is not some new agency, or that there is some federal right of action that can now be used to go after people's Second Amendment rights. At least that's how it appears to me.
That's a really good clarification. And Ron Coleman, so, this is called the National Extreme Risk Protection Order Resource Center. I mean, this sounds like it's out of, Monsters, Inc. and Disney or something. But, what can this practically do in terms of what resources are they possibly providing? To your knowledge, I mean, does this include funding or other, maybe strings attached to the states that if you don't implement our priority, then, you're going to have major adverse consequences?
Well, that's generally how it works. And I think Micah really hit the nail on the head. Once the feds get their hands on something, they call the tune. They spend money that they don't even have, but it's always more than any state can afford to say no to. But they also get to federalize the process, own the process, and use it improperly. There simply is such a bad record on the part of the federal government getting involved in things that ought to be handled by states. And then you have Supreme Court justices saying things like, well, there is federal police power, isn't there? It's a terrible idea, but it's absolutely been thought through precisely for that reason.
And so, Mike Donnelly, this should obviously be challenged. And how can or should this be challenged in court and some of these, some of these other priorities, or even just challenged in Congress, like maybe not funding this anymore? I mean, that's really the bottom line. But it also seems like a lot of these nonprofits or other, do-gooders that are in DC that have the resources for a lot of these lawsuits, a lot of the times, they will just say, well, this isn't really within our wheelhouse. This isn't in our lane. That to me is one of the biggest problems with conservative pushback, is that we don't use our resources really effectively.
Well, I saw Thomas Massey's tweet where he said we didn't authorize this, but apparently you did if you voted for the bill, and Congress voted for the bill. And, I got to give a real shout out to Senator Mike Lee, who went all out to try to stop this omnibus spending package. He basically said, look, to give members of Congress 24 hours to review a $1.2 trillion spending package is unconscionable. And I agree with him. But this is what happens. We're back to 2010, where we have to pass the bill before we can read what's in the bill. We need the Congress to step up and do its job, and the leadership needs to do the job and let people read the bill. Maybe somebody would have found this and they could have amended it out. It's hard to stop Congress from spending money, obviously, and that's a huge problem. So challenging this is going to be very difficult in court. If it's just spending money on best practices or databases and things like that, they apparently get to do that under the General Welfare Clause, which also we can debate that. But challenge it by reading the bill and then not approving it.
Yeah. Well, what does it say to you, Ron Coleman, that more Republicans voted against this spending package than voted for it? And yet, even though Republicans have the majority in Congress, somehow we sided with the Democrats and they're still calling the shots here. I think that shows that the priorities of Republicans really aren't conservative anymore.
Well, let me suggest alternatively, Republicans have never had party discipline. It's not a Bolshevik-style party as the Democrats have become, where party discipline is phenomenal. We did see party discipline in Congress during the Trump judicial nominations. And boy, if there was ever a time for it to come through, that was a heck of a good time. But by and large, Republicans consider themselves people of principle. Or, let's face it, it is always easy to, from a distance, criticize a given vote, but compromises and horse trading are part of the deal. There are two parties. Those are the options. Can we put pressure? Should we
Well,
put
and
pressure
should we
on Republicans?
compromise?
Yes.
And should we horse trade on all of these things, including abortion funding and funding for, LGBT style stuff? Well, I don't think so, but I'm going to talk about that more coming up right after this. Thanks so much to our Legal Eagle panel. We'll be right back with more.